There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people believe they already understand. They think they know it through the photographs, through the films, through the testimonies that made it onto the evening news, and eventually into museums and memorials. They think the war was misunderstood, that America went in with good intentions and came out confused. But that framing is itself part of the problem. The Vietnam War was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented, deliberately, systematically, and at every level of command. From the field sergeant who rewrote a contact report to the generals who presented fabricated statistics to the Secretary of Defense, who then stood before Congress and recited numbers that had no meaningful relationship to what was happening on the ground in Southeast Asia. The distinction matters. Misunderstanding implies an honest failure of comprehension. Misrepresentation implies a sustained and conscious effort to replace reality with something more manageable, more fundable, more politically survivable. What happened in Vietnam was the latter, and it happened not in spite of the institutional structures of the American military, but largely because of them. This is not a story about aberrant soldiers or rogue commanders acting outside the system. It is a story about how the system itself generated conditions in which truth became a liability and silence became a form of professional self-preservation. Soldiers who came home and tried to explain what they had seen were often met not with disbelief exactly, but with a kind of institutional numbness, a practiced incapacity to absorb information that contradicted the preferred narrative. The preferred narrative was that progress was being made. The preferred narrative was that the metrics were trending in the right direction. The preferred narrative was that the enemy was losing faster than they could replace their losses, which turned out to be spectacularly wrong in ways that entire agencies of the United States government had been warned about years before the Tet Offensive made the deception undeniable. The events described here are not secret in the sense that they were never documented. Most of them exist somewhere in the historical record, buried in declassified reports, in veteran testimonies collected decades after the fact, in investigative journalism that received brief attention before being absorbed into the general noise of a country that had already decided it was done processing what had happened. What made these events forbidden was not that they were unknown, but that they were unusable. They could not be integrated into any version of the war that the government was willing to defend or that the public was prepared to accept. So they were set aside. Soldiers were debriefed with the implicit understanding that certain details were not to be repeated. Unit logs were sanitized before submission. After-action reports described operations in language so abstracted from the physical reality of what had occurred that they functioned less as historical documents than as exercises in bureaucratic fiction. The war generated an enormous volume of paperwork, and almost none of it told the truth. The first thing that needs to be understood is the body count system, not because it is unknown, but because its full implications are still routinely underestimated. The body count became the primary metric of success in Vietnam under General William Westmoreland's strategy of attrition, which was built on the premise that the United States could kill the enemy faster than North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong could produce new fighters. This was a strategic theory, and like most strategic theories, it had a certain internal logic that collapsed almost immediately upon contact with the actual conditions of the war. The problem with measuring success through enemy dead was not merely methodological, though the methodology was a disaster. The deeper problem was that it created a system of incentives that rewarded the inflation of kill numbers and punished honesty. Units that reported high body counts received praise, resources, and favorable evaluations. Units that reported low body counts were questioned, scrutinized, sometimes accused of insufficient aggressiveness. The institutional pressure to produce high numbers was constant and unambiguous, and it operated at every level of the chain of command simultaneously. What this meant in practice was that the numbers reported bore an increasingly tenuous relationship to reality. Soldiers and officers across dozens of units in multiple theaters of operation have described, in testimonies given years and sometimes decades after the war, a process of casual inflation that became so normalized it stopped feeling like dishonesty. If a patrol made contact and killed 3 enemy fighters, the report might say 5. If artillery was called in on a suspected enemy position and the post-strike assessment found no bodies, the report might credit a certain number of probable kills based on blood trails or disrupted vegetation, or simply the assumption that anything in the target area had been neutralized. Rules of engagement that were themselves ambiguous enough to permit the classification of almost any adult male in a combat zone as a potential enemy combatant made the accounting even more elastic. The cumulative effect over years of daily reporting from hundreds of units was a set of aggregate statistics that were not merely imprecise but structurally disconnected from the reality they purported to measure. The Pentagon received these numbers, processed them, presented them to Congress and the public as evidence that the war was being won, and the war was not being won. There is a specific and underreported dimension to the body count problem that goes beyond simple inflation. In certain operations, particularly in free fire zones, and in the context of pacification campaigns that will be discussed in detail shortly, the people being counted were not enemy combatants, they were civilians. The pressure to produce numbers combined with the ambiguity of who constituted the enemy in a counterinsurgency environment created conditions in which civilian deaths were routinely reclassified. A Vietnamese man of fighting age found dead after an airstrike became a Viet Cong fighter in the report, regardless of whether there was any evidence that he had ever held a weapon. A woman killed in a village sweep was noted as a possible infrastructure operative. Children were sometimes not counted at all, their deaths disappearing entirely from the official record. This was not the policy of isolated units acting outside the norms of the war. It was, by the accounts of soldiers who served across multiple commands and time periods, a fairly widespread practice that was understood and accepted by most of the officers who reviewed the reports. The numbers that reached Washington had passed through so many layers of institutional processing that whatever connection they once had to actual events on the ground had long since been severed. The Phoenix program operated in this same space between official policy and unofficial practice, but with a more deliberate and more lethal organizational structure. Established in 1967 and formally codified in 1968, Phoenix was a joint American and South Vietnamese effort designed to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, meaning the networks of political organizers, tax collectors, intelligence operatives, and local administrators who sustained the insurgency at the village level. The theory was sound in a cold, strategic sense. The Viet Cong's military effectiveness depended on a civilian support structure, and disrupting that structure would degrade the insurgency's capacity to sustain itself. The implementation was something else entirely. Phoenix operated through a system of provincial reconnaissance units, which were paramilitary teams tasked with identifying, capturing, or killing members of the Viet Cong infrastructure. The program had formal guidelines that prioritized capture over killing and required some form of due process for detained suspects. In practice, the distinction between capture and kill was often academic. The provincial interrogation centers where suspects were taken were known throughout the program for the use of torture, including techniques that produced confessions from people who had no connection to the insurgency. The blacklists that identified targets were compiled from informant reports, many of which were motivated by personal grievances, land disputes, or the simple financial incentive offered for naming names. The result was that a significant portion of the people neutralized by Phoenix were not Viet Cong infrastructure at all. They were farmers, local officials, teachers, and ordinary villagers who had been named by someone with a reason to want them gone. The program's own internal assessments, some of which have been partially declassified, acknowledged problems with target accuracy and with the reliability of the intelligence feeding the blacklists. These assessments did not stop the program. They produced recommendations for procedural improvements that were sometimes adopted on paper and rarely implemented in the field. The pressure to produce neutralization numbers was, again, the dominant institutional force. Phoenix operated under quantitative targets, just as the conventional military operated under body count pressure. Teams that met their numbers were successful. Teams that raised concerns about due process or target accuracy were obstacles. By the program's own accounting, which is almost certainly an undercount given the incentives involved, Phoenix resulted in the killing of over 20,000 people during its operational period. The Vietnamese government's accounting was higher. The accounting of what percentage of those killed were actually members of the Viet Cong infrastructure, as opposed to civilians misidentified or deliberately falsely named, has never been established and almost certainly never will be. What happened at My Lai in March of 1968 is perhaps the most documented atrocity of the Vietnam War, and yet even My Lai has been systematically misrepresented in ways that serve the narrative of aberration over the narrative of system. The standard account positions My Lai as an exceptional event, a breakdown of discipline and humanity in a single unit under unusually poor leadership, an anomaly that was eventually brought to justice, however delayed and incomplete that justice was. The exceptional framing is false. My Lai was exceptional in scale and in the fact that it eventually became public. It was not exceptional in kind. The practices that produced My Lai, the classification of entire villages as enemy territory, the authorization to treat all civilians in free fire zones as potential combatants, the use of kill counts as the primary measure of unit effectiveness, the systematic dehumanization of Vietnamese civilians across years of counterinsurgency operations, these were not aberrations. They were features of the operational environment that had been constructed by command decisions made far above the level of Charlie Company. The cover-up of My Lai is where the institutional dimension becomes most visible. The massacre occurred on March 16, 1968. It was not made public until November of 1969, more than a year and a half later, and it became public only because a soldier named Ron Riddenhauer sent a letter to Congress and the Pentagon describing what he had been told by participants. The Army had investigated the event internally within months of its occurrence. That investigation, conducted by officers with obvious institutional interests in the outcome, concluded that an engagement had taken place in which enemy fighters and civilian bystanders had been killed, that the numbers were inflated, and that the matter required no further action. The investigation's findings were filed, and the files were not distributed. The officers who had conducted the cover-up were not investigated. The commander who had falsified the initial after-action report describing a successful engagement against enemy combatants received a commendation for his work that day. He was still holding that commendation when the story finally broke. The subsequent criminal investigation and court-martial proceedings resulted in the conviction of exactly one person. Lieutenant William Calley, who was sentenced to life in prison, had his sentence reduced on appeal to 20 years, was placed under house arrest by President Nixon, and was ultimately released after serving 3 years. The officers above Calley, who had ordered the operation, who had been present during or immediately after the massacre, who had conducted or participated in the cover-up, were either not charged or had charges against them dismissed. The message delivered by this outcome was not subtle. It was received clearly by soldiers throughout the theater of operations. The institution would protect itself. The individual who carried out orders to their most violent conclusion would bear whatever symbolic punishment was deemed necessary to satisfy the public. Everyone else would be fine. There were other operations like My Lai that did not become public. This is not speculation or inference, it is established historical fact. The Winter Soldier investigation, conducted in 1971, collected testimony from over 100 Vietnam veterans describing atrocities they had either witnessed or participated in, including the killing of unarmed civilians, torture of prisoners, destruction of villages without military justification, and other acts that constituted war crimes under the laws of armed conflict as they existed at the time. These testimonies were given under oath. Many of the veterans who testified provided specific dates, unit designations, locations, and the names of witnesses who could corroborate their accounts. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee held closed hearings on some of this material. The Army conducted some internal reviews. The outcomes were, with very few exceptions, the same as the outcome following the initial My Lai investigation. Files were created, reports were written, nothing happened. The treatment of prisoners is a chapter of the Vietnam War that has been almost entirely erased from the popular understanding of the conflict, except in the context of American prisoners held by North Vietnam, whose treatment has been extensively documented and is a matter of significant historical and political sensitivity. The treatment of Vietnamese prisoners held by American and South Vietnamese forces is the other side of that account, and it has not received comparable attention. The Geneva Conventions, to which the United States was a signatory, required humane treatment of prisoners of war and prohibited torture, coercion, and the use of information obtained through duress. The United States military's official position throughout the Vietnam War was that these requirements were being met. The reality in the field was substantially different. Tactical interrogation, meaning the questioning of prisoners and detainees in the immediate aftermath of capture, was routinely conducted using methods that ranged from physical coercion to torture. These methods were not the spontaneous inventions of individual soldiers acting outside their training. They were techniques that were taught, if not always formally, then through the operational culture of units and the informal instruction of more experienced soldiers, and they were conducted with the knowledge and often the active participation of officers at various levels of command. The waterboard, stress positions, electric shock applied through field telephones, mock executions, and various other methods appear repeatedly in veteran accounts across multiple units and time periods. The information obtained through these methods was of variable reliability, a fact that was understood within the intelligence community and did not substantially change the practice. Prisoners who survived tactical interrogation were sometimes transferred to formal detention facilities operated by the South Vietnamese government, where conditions were, by any reasonable assessment, in violation of international humanitarian law. The tiger cages of Con Son Island, detention cells so small that prisoners held in them for extended periods suffered permanent physical damage from confinement, became briefly public knowledge in 1970 when American civilian contractors accompanying a congressional delegation photographed them. The photographs were published. There was a period of official concern. The cells were declared to be no longer in use, which was not accurate, and the matter was largely absorbed into the general background noise of a war that was generating more controversy than any single issue could dominate for long. The rules of engagement in Vietnam were formally designed to minimize civilian casualties and to ensure that military force was applied in a legally and tactically proportionate manner. The formal rules were not how the war was fought. The actual operational standards that governed when and how force was applied evolved over the course of the war in ways that had almost no relationship to the written rules, and the gap between what the rules said and what happened in the field was managed primarily through the same mechanisms that managed every other gap between official representation and operational reality: sanitized reporting, command pressure that communicated acceptable parameters without explicitly endorsing illegal conduct, and the institutional culture of silence that surrounded anything that could create legal or political problems for the chain of command. Free fire zones, formerly designated as specified strike zones in the official nomenclature, were geographic areas in which the military had determined that the resident population had been relocated and that anyone remaining could be treated as an enemy combatant. In theory, this designation was applied only after extensive effort to relocate civilians and only in areas where the enemy presence was so overwhelming that normal engagement rules were impractical. In practice, the designation process was significantly more casual. The relocation efforts were often incomplete or entirely notional, and many of the people killed in free fire zones had no idea that their homes had been redesignated as areas where their presence made them legitimate military targets. The bombing of free fire zones, the artillery strikes, the helicopter gunship operations that swept through villages or tree lines on the basis of observed movement, all of these operated under a different and considerably more permissive understanding of who could be killed and under what circumstances than the official rules of engagement acknowledged. The defoliation program, which used Agent Orange and other herbicides on a scale that had no precedent in the history of warfare, represents a category of decision-making in which the gap between what was known and what was admitted is still being measured, because people are still dying from the consequences. The logic of the program was militarily coherent in a narrow sense. The dense jungle vegetation of Vietnam provided cover for enemy movement and supply routes, and denying that cover would degrade the enemy's tactical advantages. The herbicides, particularly Agent Orange, which was a combination of two compounds contaminated with dioxin at levels that the manufacturers had informed the government were hazardous, were sprayed from aircraft across approximately 20% of South Vietnam's total land area between 1962 and 1971. The spraying was concentrated in areas with heavy forest cover, in mangrove forests along the coast, and in agricultural areas believed to be supplying food to the Viet Cong. The health effects of dioxin exposure were not unknown at the time of the program's operation. The chemical companies producing the herbicides had conducted internal studies indicating serious health hazards. The military's own medical and scientific advisors had raised concerns that were documented in internal communications. The decision to continue the program was made with knowledge of these concerns, and the concerns were not communicated to the soldiers who were applying the herbicides, who were washing the residue off their equipment with bare hands, who were sometimes sprayed directly during aerial operations. The Vietnamese population living in or near the spray zones received no warning and no information at all. The consequences unfolded over decades. American veterans began presenting with a cluster of cancers and other diseases at rates significantly elevated above the general population. Their children were born with congenital defects that studies would eventually link to dioxin exposure. The Veterans Administration's response to these claims during the years immediately following the war was to deny any connection, to require proof that individual veterans had been exposed, and to process claims with a level of skepticism that resulted in most of them being rejected. The internal deliberations of the VA during this period, reconstructed through later investigations and litigation, make clear that the denial was not based on a genuine scientific assessment that no connection existed, but on concern about the scale of liability that would follow from acknowledging one. Compensation and acknowledgement eventually came, partially and incompletely, for American veterans. For the Vietnamese population, whose exposure was on an entirely different scale and whose health consequences were correspondingly more severe, the acknowledgement and compensation never really came at all. The relationship between the American military and the civilian population of South Vietnam, which the war was nominally being fought to protect, deteriorated steadily throughout the conflict in ways that the official narrative of pacification and winning hearts and minds was entirely unable to accommodate. Pacification was a program with its own bureaucracy, its own metrics, its own reports that bore the same relationship to operational reality as every other set of reports generated by the war. The Hamlet evaluation system, which was the primary tool used to measure pacification progress, assigned security ratings to individual villages and hamlets across South Vietnam based on assessments conducted by American advisors and South Vietnamese officials. A village rated as secure was one in which the Viet Cong infrastructure had been neutralized and in which the population was oriented toward the government rather than the insurgency. The ratings were, by the admission of many of the people who compiled them, largely fictional. The pressure to show progress in pacification was as intense as the pressure to show progress through body counts, and the structural incentives were identical. Advisors who reported that their areas were deteriorating or stagnant received scrutiny and criticism. Advisors who reported progress received positive evaluations and career advancement. The data fed into aggregate assessments that were presented to Washington as evidence that the counterinsurgency was working, and the counterinsurgency was not working in the ways the data claimed. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 demonstrated this with brutal clarity. when Viet Cong units launched coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including the American embassy in Saigon, in areas that the Hamlet evaluation system had recently rated as secure or relatively secure. The fragging problem, meaning the killing or attempted killing of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own troops, represents a dimension of the Vietnam War's internal collapse that was almost entirely suppressed in official communications during the war and has been underreported in subsequent historical treatments. The term fragging comes from the fragmentation grenade, which was a common weapon used in these incidents because it was untraceable and could be made to appear consistent with combat conditions. The practice began to emerge as a significant phenomenon around 1969 and intensified through the early 1970s as American troop morale deteriorated. Drug use became widespread in the combat forces. The war's unwinnable quality became apparent to most of the soldiers fighting it, and the gap between what soldiers were being asked to do and any coherent rationale for doing it became unbridgeable. The official Army statistics on fragging incidents acknowledged hundreds of confirmed or suspected incidents between 1969 and 1972. Veterans and military historians who have studied the phenomenon believe these numbers represent a significant undercount, because many incidents were recorded as accidental deaths or combat casualties. The same mechanisms that suppressed other categories of information, the institution found inconvenient. The fragging incidents were not random expressions of individual psychopathology. They were concentrated in specific contexts, units with high combat tempo and low perceived mission effectiveness, environments where the authority of the officer class had been substantially eroded by the visible disconnect between the conduct the war required and the values that most soldiers had brought into service with them. The Army knew about the problem. Internal memoranda from the period acknowledge it as a serious threat to unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. The public was not informed of the scale or nature of the problem, and the official communications about troop morale during the same period continued to describe a force that was performing effectively and maintaining discipline under difficult conditions. Drug use in the Vietnam-era military is a subject that has received some public attention, primarily as a social phenomenon associated with the broader cultural changes of the late 1960s, and that framing itself represents a form of misrepresentation. The drug problem in Vietnam was not simply a reflection of what was happening in American society at large. It was also a product of specific conditions created by the war itself. Heroin of extraordinarily high purity was available in South Vietnam at prices that made it accessible to soldiers on military pay. The supply chain for this heroin involved actors within the South Vietnamese government and military that the United States was fighting to preserve, and there is documented evidence that elements of the South Vietnamese military hierarchy were involved in the heroin trade in ways that American intelligence was aware of and chose not to disrupt, because the disruption would have created political complications with the allies the United States depended on. By 1971, the Army's own drug abuse assessment estimated that between 10 and 15% of American soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin regularly. Marijuana use was considerably more widespread. The Department of Defense's public statements during this period acknowledged a drug problem while consistently characterizing its scale and operational impact as manageable. The characterization was not accurate. Units were fielding soldiers who were intoxicated during operations. Medical personnel were treating overdoses in field conditions. The military's effort to address the problem focused primarily on detection and punishment rather than treatment, an approach that predictably drove the problem underground without reducing its prevalence. The soldiers who came home addicted to heroin found a VA system that was unprepared for the scale of the problem and an institutional culture that preferred to characterize addiction as a personal failure rather than a predictable outcome of the conditions the military had placed those soldiers in. The Strategic Hamlet program, which preceded the formal pacification programs and was one of the earliest large-scale American counterinsurgency initiatives in South Vietnam, generated a specific and largely unacknowledged category of atrocity in the forced relocation of Vietnamese civilians from their ancestral villages into government-controlled settlements. The program, modeled in part on British counterinsurgency practices in Malaya, was premised on the idea that separating the peasant population from the insurgency's base of rural support would degrade the Viet Cong's ability to recruit, supply itself, and move through the countryside. The premise had a certain logic. The implementation was catastrophic. Vietnamese peasants had deep cultural and spiritual connections to the land of their ancestors. Connections expressed through the maintenance of ancestral graves and shrines that were physically located in the villages where families had lived for generations. Being removed from these villages was not experienced as a neutral relocation, but as a profound violation of everything that structured their relationship to the world. The strategic hamlets were poorly constructed, inadequately supplied, and provided none of the economic opportunity or security that had been promised. Many of the people relocated into them had no particular loyalty to either side before their relocation, and emerged from the experience oriented firmly against the government that had uprooted them. The program was officially declared a failure and discontinued, but the populations that had been displaced were often not returned to their original villages, which had in many cases been destroyed, and the resentment generated by the program contributed directly to the Viet Cong's ability to recruit and maintain support in areas where it had previously been limited. The air war over North Vietnam, particularly the sustained bombing campaigns of Rolling Thunder from 1965 to 1968 and Linebacker and Linebacker II in 1972, was presented to the American public and to Congress primarily in terms of its strategic effects on North Vietnam's military capacity and its diplomatic leverage on Hanoi's negotiating position. The actual operational effects and the civilian casualty figures associated with these campaigns were managed with a level of control that made the body count manipulations in the ground war look relatively transparent by comparison. The United States Air Force compiled extensive post-strike assessments of bombing effectiveness, and these assessments were consistently more pessimistic about the strategic impact of the bombing than the public statements of the administration and the military leadership. The infrastructure that was bombed was rebuilt. The supply lines that were interdicted continued to function. The population of North Vietnam did not, as several optimistic assessments had predicted, turn against a government that was absorbing such punishment, but rather rallied around it. The civilian casualties produced by the bombing of North Vietnam were not prominently featured in American official communications for reasons that are not difficult to understand. The Air Force tracked these numbers internally with more precision than the casualty reporting in the ground war, and the numbers were not small. Hanoi and other urban areas were struck repeatedly by campaigns that, whatever their intent, produced substantial civilian deaths. The bombing of dike systems in North Vietnam, which was denied by the Nixon administration and is still disputed in some historical treatments, was substantiated by multiple independent observers, including international journalists and representatives of foreign governments who inspected the damage and concluded that dikes had been struck in ways inconsistent with incidental collateral damage. The dike system controlled flooding across North Vietnam's primary agricultural regions, and its disruption threatened the food supply of a civilian population that had nothing to do with the military decisions of the government in Hanoi. None of this appeared in the official accounting of what the air war was accomplishing. The relationship between American commanders and their South Vietnamese counterparts in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was described in official communications as a partnership between professional military establishments working toward shared objectives. The actual relationship was characterized by contempt, dysfunction, and a pattern of American unilateralism that undermined the stated objective of building an effective South Vietnamese military capable of sustaining the war effort without American support, which was the theory underlying Vietnamization, the Nixon administration's strategy for withdrawing American forces while maintaining the war. The contempt was not hidden. It was expressed openly in the private communications of American officers and in the informal culture of advisory relationships throughout the theater. ARVN soldiers were characterized in terms that reflected the full range of racial condescension available in American military culture of the period. Their courage was doubted, their reliability was questioned, and their casualties, which were in every year of the war substantially higher than American casualties, were treated as strategically less significant than American losses. The Vietnamization program required transferring enormous quantities of American military equipment to South Vietnamese forces while simultaneously withdrawing the American personnel who had been operating that equipment. The program's architects acknowledged in internal assessments that the timeline for Vietnamization was determined primarily by American domestic political pressures rather than by any realistic assessment of ARVN's readiness to assume the combat burden. The timeline was politically necessary but militarily untenable, and the people responsible for designing the program knew this while publicly describing it as a strategy with a sound basis in operational reality. The fall of South Vietnam in April 1975, which came not as a gradual deterioration, but as a rapid collapse that surprised even some of the pessimistic internal assessors, was the terminal demonstration of the gap between the program's public premise and its private evaluation. The intelligence community's role in Vietnam is a study in the institutional costs of telling people what they do not want to hear. Throughout the war, analysts at the Central Intelligence Agency and within the Defense Intelligence Agency produced assessments of the war's trajectory that were significantly more pessimistic than the assessments the military leadership was providing to the Johnson and Nixon administrations. The CIA's 1967 internal assessment of the prospects for the American strategy concluded that the approach was not achieving its objectives and was unlikely to do so, that the enemy's will and capacity to absorb losses were being consistently underestimated, and that the metrics being used to measure progress were not measuring progress in any meaningful sense. This assessment was distributed within the intelligence community. It did not become the basis for a reassessment of strategy. It was noted, processed, and set aside in favor of the military's more optimistic reporting. The Order of Battle controversy of 1967, in which the CIA and the Military Assistance Command Vietnam engaged in a sustained and bitter dispute over how to count enemy forces, is one of the most clearly documented examples of institutional truth management in the Vietnam War record. The CIA's analysts, working from available intelligence, produced enemy strength estimates that were substantially higher than the figures MACV had been reporting. The higher figures would have demonstrated that American attrition strategy was failing, because even with the inflated kill counts the military was reporting, the enemy was not being depleted. MACV refused to accept the CIA's numbers. The dispute escalated to the point where it involved direct intervention at the senior level of the government, and the resolution was not a rigorous, independent assessment of the evidence, but a political compromise in which the numbers reported publicly remained closer to MACV's lower figures. General Westmoreland later faced legal proceedings related to his role in this episode, when a CBS documentary accused him of deliberately deceiving the public about enemy strength. The case was settled. No finding of fact was made. The treatment of American soldiers returning from Vietnam represents a final category of institutional misrepresentation that operated after the fact rather than during the conflict. The picture of returning veterans being spat upon by anti-war protesters, which became a persistent element of the cultural memory of the war, has been examined by historians and found to have virtually no documented basis in fact. It is not that individual incidents never occurred, but the systematic, widespread practice that the image implies was not real. What was real was the institutional failure to receive these veterans, to process what they had experienced and witnessed, to provide the medical and psychological support that the scale of trauma they were carrying required. The VA system was underfunded, undertrained, and administratively oriented toward denying claims rather than establishing them. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not recognized as a diagnostic category until 1980. which meant that for the years immediately following the war, soldiers who were experiencing the full clinical presentation of combat trauma were either told their symptoms were not real, prescribed inadequate treatments, or simply turned away. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans in the years following the war significantly exceeded the number of Americans killed in combat during the war itself. This is a statistic that has been established by multiple independent studies and is not seriously disputed. It represents the final accounting of what the war cost in human terms, at least for the American participants, and it received a small fraction of the public attention given to the combat casualty figures. The institutional response to this phenomenon was sluggish and inadequate for reasons that are now fairly well understood and that mirror the patterns that characterized every other dimension of the war's management. Acknowledging the scale of psychological casualties would have required acknowledging something about the nature of what soldiers had been asked to do, about the conditions in which they had been placed, about the gap between the war's official purpose and its operational reality. It was easier, institutionally, to process the suicide statistics as a social problem adjacent to the war rather than as a direct consequence of it. The fall of Saigon, which ended the American phase of the Vietnam War, was preceded by intelligence assessments that accurately described the military situation and that were not acted upon because acting upon them would have required admitting publicly what the internal assessments had been saying for years. The evacuation of American personnel and of South Vietnamese who had worked with the American effort was conducted in conditions of near-total chaos, partly because planning for the evacuation had been constrained by the political impossibility of being seen to plan for it. Acknowledging the need to plan for evacuation would have been equivalent to acknowledging that the war was lost, and the war could not officially be lost until it was impossible to represent it as anything else, which happened to be the same moment when organized evacuation was no longer fully feasible. The Vietnamese who had worked as interpreters, intelligence assets, administrative staff, and in dozens of other capacities for the American military and government had been given implicit and sometimes explicit assurances that they would be protected if the situation deteriorated. The scale of the evacuation that was actually accomplished left large numbers of these people behind. The consequences for many of them were severe. This outcome was not the result of a sudden failure of planning in the final days of April 1975. It was the culmination of years of official representations about the war's trajectory that had made adequate planning impossible by making honest assessment politically unacceptable. The people left behind paid for that institutional incapacity with their freedom and in some cases with their lives, and their abandonment received less sustained public attention than almost any other aspect of the war's end. The landmines and unexploded ordnance that remained distributed across the former war zones of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia constitute a form of ongoing consequence that makes the designation of an end date for the Vietnam War somewhat arbitrary. The United States dropped more ordnance on Laos alone than was dropped on Germany and Japan combined during the entirety of the Second World War. A significant percentage of the bombs dropped did not detonate on impact. They remain in the soil, and they continue to kill and maim people who are not veterans of any war, but simply people living in the areas where the war was fought. The contamination of agricultural land, the restriction of development in heavily bombed areas, the children and farmers who are still being killed decades after the last American soldier left, these are not historical footnotes. They are the continuing operational effects of decisions made in Washington and Saigon and in the command posts of the 7th Air Force. Decisions that were made with some knowledge of the long-term contamination problem and that were made anyway because the operational priorities of the moment dominated every other consideration. Agent Orange's legacy operates on a similar timeline. The dioxin contamination of Vietnamese soil in the areas most heavily sprayed has a half-life measured not in years, but in decades, and under some conditions, centuries. The health consequences continue to manifest in the children and grandchildren of people who were exposed through mechanisms involving epigenetic transmission that science was not equipped to document when the spraying was occurring. The Vietnamese government's estimates of the number of people affected by Agent Orange-related health conditions are in the millions. The legal proceedings through which Vietnamese plaintiffs attempted to hold the chemical manufacturers accountable were dismissed on grounds that the use of herbicides in warfare did not, at the time, constitute a violation of international law in a way that created civil liability. The manufacturers, having produced a product they knew was contaminated with a highly toxic compound, having been informed of this contamination, having supplied the product to the military with knowledge of how it would be used and in what quantities, faced no legal accountability for the consequences. The soldiers who came home and tried to describe what they had seen and done found themselves in a country that did not have an available vocabulary for what they were describing. This is not entirely metaphorical. The cultural frameworks through which Americans understood warfare had been formed by the Second World War and to some extent by Korea, frameworks in which the moral clarity of the American cause was not a matter of serious public question, and in which the behavior of American forces was understood through the lens of collective heroism and individual sacrifice. Vietnam did not fit these frameworks, and the dissonance created by the attempt to force it into them produced something that looked from a distance like confusion, but was experienced from the inside as a kind of sustained cognitive assault. Soldiers who had participated in operations that they understood to be wrong, who had followed orders they knew violated the standards they had been raised with, who had witnessed things they could not describe without implicating themselves and their units, and the entire institutional apparatus that had put them in those positions. These soldiers came home to a culture that wanted either heroes or victims and had no category for something more complicated. The records of what happened in Vietnam continue to be processed, in the sense that archives are still being declassified, that historians are still finding documents that add texture and specificity to what is already broadly known, that veterans are still giving interviews and depositions and testimonies that fill in details the official record omitted. The broad outlines have been visible for decades. The body count manipulation, the Phoenix program's targets, the civilian casualties of the air war, the fragging incidents, the drug epidemic, the institutional suppression of inconvenient intelligence, the abandonment of Vietnamese allies, the ongoing contamination of the landscape. These are not secrets in any meaningful sense. They are simply facts that exist in a different register from the facts that structure the public memory of the war. They live in the declassified files and the veteran testimonies and the investigative histories that were written and read, and then put aside because the culture that produced the war did not then and has not since found a way to fully absorb what those facts mean about itself. The soldiers who were debriefed after operations in which things had happened that were not going to appear in the after-action reports understood, in most cases without being told explicitly, what was expected of them. They understood it from the questions that were not asked, from the language of the questions that were asked, from the institutional culture that had formed them, and that communicated its priorities through texture and implication as much as through direct instruction. The silence that was maintained was not always comfortable. Veterans have described the weight of carrying specific memories that they understood could not be shared, not because anyone had explicitly told them not to share them, but because the structure of the institution they had served and the structure of the culture they returned to made sharing them a form of institutional and social self-destruction. Some of them maintained that silence for the rest of their lives. Others eventually broke it, in testimonies given to historians, in memoirs published long after the operational and institutional stakes had diminished, in conversations with family members who had been waiting for decades to understand what had happened to the person who came home. The war ended for the United States in a formal sense in January 1973, with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, and in a practical sense in April 1975, when the last helicopters lifted off from the embassy roof in Saigon. It did not end in any meaningful sense for the millions of Vietnamese people in whose country it had been fought, for the Laotians and Cambodians whose territory had been treated as an extension of the Vietnamese operational theater, without particular regard for their sovereignty or their civilian populations, for the veterans of all nationalities who carried its consequences in their bodies and their minds for the remainder of their lives. The metrics by which success had been measured had been revealed as fictional. The strategy that the metrics were designed to support had failed. The political objective for which the strategy had been designed, the preservation of a non-communist South Vietnam, had been abandoned years before the fall of Saigon in everything but official rhetoric. The war continued for a long time after anyone in the chain of command could identify a coherent purpose for its continuation. That is perhaps the most accurate single statement that can be made about it. Decisions were made, operations were conducted, people were killed and wounded and permanently damaged, villages were destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again, and the institutional machinery that processed all of this into reports and statistics and briefing slides continued to function with its characteristic efficiency long after the purpose that had originally been used to justify its activation had dissolved into something no one in a position of authority was willing to name out loud. The last American combat soldiers left Vietnam in 1973. The bombing of Cambodia continued until Congress forced it to stop in August of that year. The covert operations in Laos, which had been conducted under a classification so deep that Congress had not been fully informed of their scope, continued for some time after that. The paperwork continued to flow.